Have you ever felt truly trapped? Not just confined by walls of brick and steel, but by the invisible bars of your own past? Imagine a place where sunlight is rationed through a sliver of a window, where silence echoes louder than any scream, and where your own mind becomes your most brutal prison warden. For nearly a year, that was my reality. A juvenile facility masked as a rehabilitation center, a place where they said I could be helped, healed, but all I felt was gray. Gray walls, gray days, gray future. My only solace? That fragile beam of morning light, a fleeting visitor to my concrete tomb. They called me dangerous, murderer, labels that felt too heavy for my 15 years, brands seared onto my soul for a crime I never set out to commit, a life I extinguished in a moment of blind rage. Regret? It's a hollow word, a whisper in a hurricane, utterly useless against the crushing weight of what I'd done. The judge, looking down from his towering bench, saw a child too young for adult prison, yet too volatile for a standard juvenile program. So, they sent me here, to this high-security mental institution, a place of evaluation, they said. Evaluation for what? For being human? For being broken? I used to think solitude was my personal hell. The isolation, the constant replay of that horrific day in my head, the gnawing emptiness. I was wrong. Hell, as it turned out, had far more terrifying layers. It started subtly, a tremor in the routine, whispers replacing the usual sterile silence. The orderlies, usually stoic, began to murmur in hushed tones, their faces tight with anxiety. I'd catch snippets as they hurried past my cell, neighborhood sealed off, acting strangely, infection, during group therapy, a forced, sterile exercise in pretending to heal. Dr. Whitley, our head psychiatrist, tried to project an aura of normalcy. Calm voice, neat pen, tapping clipboard. But her eyes were betraying her carefully constructed facade. They darted constantly towards the window behind us, flickering with a fear she couldn't quite mask. Session cut short, a mere 10 minutes. Unheard of. Dr. Whitley, usually the epitome of composed professionalism, seemed scattered. She rushed us back to our rooms, a hurried escort, murmuring about patience, about waiting for instructions, then vanished down the echoing corridor, her usually measured footsteps almost frantic. The rumors intensified that evening, seeping through the porous walls of the institution like a chilling draft. Staff whispers, overheard fragments, pieced together into a terrifying mosaic. Infection, spreading fast, hospital wards overflowing, strange behavior. An orderly, his voice laced with panic, muttered about hospital wards being over capacity and people changing as soon as they got sick. Infected. The word hung in the air, thick with unspoken dread. That night, sleep was a distant dream, a luxury I couldn't afford. Lying on my narrow cot, the thin blanket offering little comfort against the growing chill of fear, I strained my ears, listening through the heavy door, beyond the thick walls. A security guard, his voice strained and desperate, was shouting into his phone, his words punctuated by static and rising panic. No, they can't just seal us in. We have minors in here, minors. Then, static, a jarring silence, followed by footsteps, quick, nervous, receding down the hall, leaving me alone with the fragments of his terror. Outskirts of the city. Isolation was usually our curse, keeping us locked away from the real world. Now, it felt like a terrifying vulnerability. Few visitors, no real connection to the outside. TV privileges were rare, carefully controlled, filtered. But whatever was happening, it sounded big and close. The next morning, the air itself felt different, heavy with unspoken fear. The staff, their faces obscured by makeshift face masks, moved like ghosts through the corridors. One nurse, her eyes wide and wild, carried a plastic shield clumsily fashioned, as if expecting a physical assault rather than an unseen contagion. Riot? I dared to ask, my voice raspy from disuse. She didn't stop, didn't even look at me, just mumbled, "Stay in your cell," her voice flat, devoid of any reassurance, and walked on, her eyes half crazed, lost somewhere beyond the present moment. Total lockdown. The overhead lights flickered, a momentary dance of shadows that set my teeth on edge, followed by a crackling announcement over the speakers, the amplified voice of authority failing to inspire any semblance of calm. Attention all residents, you must remain in your assigned rooms. This is a precautionary measure. Do not attempt to leave. We are awaiting instructions from city officials. Precautionary? My heart hammered against my ribs. I shot to my feet, pressing my ear against the cold steel of the door, trying to glean some truth from the muffled sounds beyond. Protests erupted across the ward, a chorus of fear and fury. Kids yelling, banging on doors, voices raw with panic. Even those of us who had done terrible things, who were deemed too dangerous for the outside world, we didn't want to be caged, not now, not during whatever crisis was unfolding. A siren wailed in the distance, its mournful cry echoing through the gray building, followed by a strange, rhythmic thumping on the walls. Barricades? Or something else? Something more desperate? Dr. Whitley's voice, amplified, distorted, blared through the speakers again, more urgent this time. A frantic attempt at control that only amplified the chaos. Remain calm. We have received reports of an outbreak of unknown origin. You are safe. We are taking every measure to protect you. Safe? The word felt like a cruel joke, a blatant lie echoing through the sterile hallways. Calm? Impossible. Late that afternoon, the power died. Silence descended, thick and suffocating, broken only by the frantic thumping of my own heart. Darkness swallowed the gray, leaving only the faint, ethereal light filtering through the small window, the one constant in my year of captivity. Then, just as suddenly, after what felt like an eternity but was probably only 5 minutes, the overhead bulbs flickered back on, a jarring return to artificial light, but the brief darkness had shattered whatever fragile composure remained. The hallway exploded in sound, running footsteps, slamming doors echoing like gunshots in the confined space. The clang of a security gate shuttering closed somewhere further down the corridor. Panic was a living thing now, breathing, spreading, consuming everything in its path. I paced my small cell, caged, trapped, eyes fixed on that tiny rectangle of glass near the ceiling, my only window to a world that was rapidly unraveling. Gray clouds blanketed the sky, mirroring the storm within me. And then, I saw it. Movement in the courtyard beyond. A shape. Human? Maybe. Lumbering, circling aimlessly. A grotesque parody of life. I forced myself to look away, to not think about it, to bury myself in the familiar darkness of my own guilt. I remembered my crime. That's what I did whenever fear threatened to overwhelm me. Whenever anxiety clawed at my throat, stealing my breath. I replayed it, again and again. The moment everything shattered, the instant my life veered irrevocably off course. The rage, hot, blinding, consuming. The tragedy that followed. I didn't enjoy it, no, but I couldn't pretend it was an accident either. A choice. A terrible, irreversible choice. Maybe, a desperate, foolish part of me had hoped, if the world was ending, if everything was collapsing into chaos, then my punishment wouldn't matter anymore. Maybe, in the face of global apocalypse, my crime would become insignificant, irrelevant. Maybe, then, I could be free. Free at last. But I never expected the path to freedom to be paved with such horror, such haunting screams. The screams started in the evening, tearing through the fragile silence, echoing across the empty cafeteria, down the long, sterile corridor, penetrating the thick walls of each cell, invading our nightmares. Screams of absolute, unadulterated panic. I leaped from my cot, heart hammering, adrenaline surging, pressing my face against the narrow window in the cell door, desperate for any scrap of information, any glimpse of reality in this descent into madness. Orderlies rushed past, a blur of terrified faces etched with primal fear. Behind them, a figure stumbled, shambling, a grotesque silhouette in a tattered uniform. One of the orderlies, his voice cracking with desperation, shouted back, "Stay back!" But the figure didn't stop. It moved with a sickening jerking motion, as if its body had forgotten the simple mechanics of walking. arms outstretched, reaching blindly, but its eyes were what truly chilled me to the bone. Glassy, vacant, utterly devoid of life, of humanity. The orderlies disappeared around the corner, swallowed by the echoing corridor, and the figure followed, its stumbling gait a horrifying promise of what was to come. Then, another shape emerged from the shadows, a security guard, clutching his side, breathing in ragged gasps, his face contorted in pain. Flickering lights cast long, grotesque shadows, illuminating red droplets blooming on his crisp white shirt. He fumbled frantically at the keypad of a locked steel door at the end of the hall, his fingers trembling, desperation radiating from him in waves. Code punched in, door clicked open, guard lunged through, steel door clanged shut, sealing him away, leaving me staring at the cold, unforgiving metal. That was the last I saw of him. Something monumental was happening. I could feel it, a terrifying premonition, rattling in my chest like a second, monstrous heartbeat. Hours ticked by, or maybe just minutes, time losing all meaning in the suffocating gloom. Then, the overhead lights died completely, plunged us into absolute darkness, and the red emergency bulbs flickered on, casting the world in a lurid, blood-soaked glow. That's when the real chaos erupted. Another scream, closer this time, raw and desperate, ripped through the silence. A nurse, pale as death, trembling violently, ran past my door, her eyes wide with terror, fumbling at the locks of each cell, her voice a fractured whisper. "You have to leave. They're inside. Hurry." She reached my door, her movements jerky, fueled by pure adrenaline, jabbed a key into the metal lock, yanked the handle, and pulled it open, her breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. I stumbled out, blinking, eyes struggling to adjust to the blood-red glow, the world distorted, surreal, bathed in emergency light. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice shaking, barely a whisper. "Leaving our cells?" It was unthinkable, a violation of every rule, every enforced routine of the past year. "Most of the staff are gone," she panted, her words broken, disjointed. "It's not safe here." "Gone?" I glanced around, disoriented, lost in the shifting shadows. Kids, my age, older teens, spilling out of their rooms, confusion etched on their faces, a mixture of fear and bewildered disbelief. Some were crying, silent tears streaming down their faces. Others were too petrified to speak, their eyes wide, unseeing. I saw Ashton, the tall boy, rumored to have done something even darker than my own crime, his past shrouded in whispers and hushed speculation. Our eyes met for a fleeting moment. He looked as startled, as utterly lost, as I felt. The nurse, herding us forward, desperate energy driving her onward, kept ushering us down the corridor. "Stay together. We'll head toward the staff exit. Security is left. We can get out." Security? What security? Everything had crumbled, dissolved into chaos. "Are there any staff still here?" I forced the words out, my throat tight with fear. Her eyes darted nervously behind us, as if expecting something to materialize from the shadows. "Dr. Whitley." She tried to call for help. I'm not sure." Suddenly, footsteps, heavy, pounding, echoed from the far end of the corridor, growing louder, closer. A shape rounded the corner, a looming silhouette in the dim red light. We couldn't see who it was, human or something else. The nurse froze, her body rigid with fear, lifted her arms in front of her, a flimsy, utterly useless shield against whatever was coming. Then, the shape raced forward, a staff member, face contorted in a mask of pure, unadulterated panic, eyes wide with terror. She stumbled, fell hard, crashing to the floor, tried to scramble back to her feet, but she was tackled from behind, slammed down by another figure that sprinted too fast, too stiff, too unnatural. All we could make out was the faint silhouette, a dark shape pinning her to the floor, a grotesque tableau of horror unfolding before our eyes. I heard her scream, a raw, agonizing sound that was abruptly cut short. Then, nothing. Silence. A terrifying, absolute nothingness. "Run!" the nurse shrieked, her voice torn, primal. We sprinted, blindly, desperately, past the pinned staff member, eyes averted, hearts hammering against our ribs, a frantic, chaotic escape. Halfway down the next corridor, a metal gate loomed, a security measure meant to contain us, to keep residents in place during alerts. But it stood half open, jammed at an awkward angle, locked, useless, a symbol of the failed order we were fleeing. A second nurse, her face pale and streaked with sweat, knelt by the control panel, frantically hitting buttons that no longer worked, her movements jerky, desperate. The overhead alarm's red glow drenched the entire hallway in a nightmarish, haunting filter. "They cut the power to the gates," the second nurse whispered, her voice trembling, wiping sweat from her brow. "I can't open it fully." "Then we'll squeeze through," the first nurse said, her voice strained, pushing past fear, focusing on survival. One by one, we slipped through the narrow gap, scraping against cold metal, squeezing through the claustrophobic space. A few of the older kids, fueled by adrenaline and a desperate will to survive, offered to help, pushing, prying at the jammed gate, trying to widen the opening. But it was stuck fast, immovable. Suddenly, that same stumbling gait, that horrifying shuffling sound, echoed from behind us, growing closer. We could see the shape of something creeping closer, a dark, menacing silhouette. "Move! Move!" the first nurse shouted, her voice raw with urgency. I slid through the gate, heart pounding like a war drum in my chest, just as a low, guttural moan rippled through the corridor, a sound that seemed to vibrate in the very bones. My heart pounded so loudly I couldn't hear anything else, the blood roaring in my ears, drowning out the world. But what I glimpsed in that fleeting moment, as I squeezed through the gate, was seared into my mind forever. Pale skin, stretched taut, sunken eyes, black holes in a landscape of decaying flesh, an expression devoid of all humanity, all life. It lunged forward, a grotesque puppet animated by some unseen horror, as if drawn by the slightest sound, the faintest breath, the very essence of life. We dashed into the next corridor, a blind, desperate flight. Beyond the corridor, a small outdoor courtyard, a sliver of open space in our concrete prison. Rain drizzled from the sky, cold, cleansing, yet offering little comfort against the terror that clung to us like a shroud. In the gloom, I could make out several sets of footprints in the mud, remnants of previous attempts to escape, ghosts of staff who had tried to flee earlier, footprints that vanished near the high perimeter fence, ending abruptly, swallowed by the unforgiving earth. A few paper documents, soaked, illegible, plastered to the ground, swirling in small puddles, remnants of a world that was dissolving around us. The nurse, still somehow holding it together, leading us forward with a grim determination, guided us toward a large side gate, heavy, imposing, that opened out to the staff parking lot. In normal circumstances, it was heavily guarded, a symbol of our confinement, our lack of freedom. Now, only emptiness greeted us, a stark, unsettling void. The gate stood cracked open, a silent invitation, a doorway to the unknown. Outside, one flickering street light cast a sickly yellow glow, revealing a city skyline tinted with an ominous, unnatural hue. The air hung heavy with dread, with the unspoken promise of horror. I swallowed the lump in my throat, a knot of fear and something else, something akin to exhilaration. This was it, the boundary, the line I was never supposed to cross without permission, without an escort, without the ever-present watchful eyes of authority. The staff had drilled it into us, day after day, year after year. To leave without permission meant more charges, more locked doors, more years stolen from our already fractured lives. But the facility had collapsed, order had disintegrated, and suddenly, nothing seemed to matter anymore. A part of me, a reckless, desperate part, felt almost dizzy with the sheer, terrifying possibility of stepping beyond those gates, of being truly, terrifyingly free for the first time in what felt like forever. But another part, the heavier, darker part, the part that carried the weight of my crime, remembered remembered that I was a murderer, and no matter what happened out there, no matter how the world ended, that fact wouldn't change. Guilt, like a shadow, stretched long and dark behind me, threatening to swallow any flicker of hope. We pressed forward, our shoes crunching on broken glass scattered near a guard booth, a small, vulnerable structure that offered no protection now. The booth's door hung wide open, ripped from its hinges. Something, some force, had violently forced its way inside, leaving deep, gouging marks in the metal, a testament to brutal, terrifying power. The nurse, her eyes scanning the desolate parking lot, guided us onward, searching desperately for any running vehicles, any signs of remaining staff, any vestige of hope. Some of the older teens, their voices cracking with desperation, began shouting for help, their calls swallowed by the vast emptiness of the parking lot. The nurse frantically waved at them to be quiet, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. "You don't want to attract attention," she hissed, her voice a strained whisper, barely audible above the pounding of my own heart. That's when we heard it, a low, rasping moan, carried on the chilling wind, echoing off the cold concrete walls, growing louder, closer, too close. From behind a row of parked cars, four shapes emerged, stumbling in unison, their movements jerky, unnatural, arms dangling oddly at their sides, grotesque puppets animated by some unseen force. My heart lurched in my chest, a violent, sickening thud. At the sight of their vacant expressions, their dead, lifeless eyes, the nurse gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, stifling a scream. None of us wanted to acknowledge what they really were, what the rumors had whispered, what our deepest fears had already conjured. We'd heard the whispers, the frantic pronouncements, the terrifying implications, but seeing them in person, in the cold, harsh light of reality, was something entirely different, something that chilled you to the very core of your being. They weren't in any hurry. They moved slowly, deliberately, but with an unsettling, single-minded purpose, a horrifying focus on the living. The small group of kids instinctively took a step back, a collective retreat from the encroaching horror. I felt Ashton, the tall boy, his presence solid, strangely comforting in the chaos at my side. He muttered, his voice low, strained, "We have to go around them." The nurse nodded quickly, her eyes darting around, desperate for an escape route, and pointed in the opposite direction, a desperate gamble. But we only made it a few steps before we realized the chilling truth. There were more of them, many more. Those figures, those grotesque parodies of human life, were behind us too, staggering from the shadows, emerging from between parked cars, from behind dumpsters, from every darkened corner of the parking lot. They formed a sort of grotesque half-circle, closing in, cutting off our escape routes, trapping us in a horrifying vice. Without warning, one of the older teens, his eyes wild with panic, his face a mask of terror, bolted. He sprinted between two cars, a desperate, foolish dash for freedom, towards the high perimeter fence, a symbol of our captivity turned into a beacon of false hope. The nurse called after him, her voice cracking with desperation, but he kept running, heedless of her warnings, driven by pure, unthinking panic. A shape lurched out from behind the fence, a dark, horrifying silhouette materializing from the shadows, catching him off guard, ambushing him. I turned away, couldn't bear to watch, couldn't face the inevitable horror. "As quietly as you can," the nurse whispered, her voice barely audible, pointing at an opening to a side road near the edge of the lot, a narrow sliver of escape, a desperate gamble. "We'll slip through there." We moved carefully, silently, as if moving through a minefield, every step measured, every breath held. The shapes in the parking lot, thankfully, seemed to have trouble moving quickly, their shambling gait a small mercy in this nightmare. We hoped, prayed, that we could get around them, unseen, unheard, a fragile hope in the face of overwhelming horror. I forced myself not to look back at the teen who had run, couldn't bear to imagine what was happening behind us. Deep down, I knew I couldn't save him, couldn't save anyone. We wove between parked cars, a silent, terrified procession, keeping low, hugging the cold metal of the vehicles, my breath thundering in my ears, each gasp a desperate prayer for silence, for invisibility. At one point, passing a shattered car window, I glanced inside, a fleeting, involuntary movement, and saw keys hanging from the ignition, dangling there, tauntingly close, a phantom promise of escape. My heart skipped a beat, a surge of desperate hope, quickly extinguished by the cold, hard reality. Maybe we could drive away. But I was 15. I didn't know the first thing about driving. Innocence, lost too young, in so many ways. Eventually, miraculously, we made it to the side road's tall fence, the last barrier between us and the unknown terrors of the city. The nurse and Ashton, their faces grim, their movements efficient, helped pull the chain-link gate aside, a rusted, groaning sound that seemed deafening in the oppressive silence. Just enough room for me and another kid to slip through, one by one, a slow, agonizing process. Only after we were all out, huddled together on the narrow sidewalk, did I finally notice the true, terrifying silence of the city. No distant hum of traffic, no blare of horns, no comforting murmur of voices, just a low, chilling breeze and the occasional, distant moan, carried on the wind, a harbinger of death. We ventured onto the main street, a ghost road in a ghost town. Flickering lamp posts cast long, distorted shadows, stretching across the cracked pavement. Some storefronts, abandoned relics of a former life, had their lights still on, ghostly beacons in the desolation. But the windows were shattered, gaping holes revealing emptiness and decay. Vehicles sat abandoned in the middle of the road, doors hanging open, as if the drivers had fled in terror, abandoning everything in their desperate flight. The entire area felt empty, hollowed out, a ghost town, populated only by shadows and fear. Curtains and broken windows swayed in the wind, like ghostly sighs, whispers of a life that had vanished. We huddled together near the curb, a small, fragile island of humanity in a sea of desolation, scanning the deserted streets, desperate for a path forward, any direction that offered a glimmer of hope. I still stuck close to the nurse, her presence a fragile tether to the world of adults, to the remnants of order and authority. Then, I caught sight of a distant group, maybe half a block away, moving slowly, erratically, on the far side of the street. At first, a flicker of desperate hope, survivors? But the way they moved, in fits and starts, jerky, unnatural, swaying postures, told me the horrifying truth. More of the infected, drifting aimlessly among the deserted cars, drawn by some unknown instinct, some primal hunger. The nurse motioned for us to stay quiet, her face grim, her eyes fixed on the distant figures, guiding us around the corner, a silent, terrified procession, clinging to the shadows. We walked in single file, a desperate, vulnerable line, trying not to draw attention, every nerve on edge, every sense heightened, straining for any sound, any sign of danger. At every unexpected noise, a rustle of wind, a creak of metal, we jumped, startled, hearts leaping into our throats. Broken glass crunched underfoot, a constant, grating reminder of the shattered world around us. An overturned trash bin spilled its contents across the sidewalk, a chaotic mess of debris, mirroring the chaos within us. Finally, a tall office building loomed ahead, a silent monolith in the deserted cityscape, with a side door slightly ajar, a potential haven, a possible trap. The nurse held up a hand, signaling us to stop, to wait, indicating we should investigate, cautiously, desperately. With a trembling push, Ashton shoved the door open further, widening the gap, revealing a dark hallway beyond, a narrow, shadowed passage with a single flickering fluorescent bulb overhead, casting long, distorted shadows, a promise of deeper darkness within. "Let's get inside," the nurse whispered, her voice strained, barely audible. "We can regroup and make a plan." We slipped in, one by one, a silent, hesitant entry into the unknown, until the last of us was safe behind the heavy door, sealed away, for now, from the terrors of the street. The building's lobby was dim, cavernous, shadows stretching across old, worn tile floors, swallowing the weak light. Chairs stood in disarray, overturned, scattered like fallen soldiers, as if people had abruptly pushed them aside, fleeing in panic, leaving behind the remnants of their ordinary lives. A front desk, cold and impersonal, with a computer, dark and lifeless, lay empty, deserted, a monument to a world that had ceased to function. The nurse, her eyes still scanning, still searching for any sign of safety, of hope, found a small storeroom near the lobby entrance, a cramped, windowless space. She ushered us in, herding us like frightened sheep, whispering, "We should stay quiet until we're certain it's safe." There were about 8 of us total, a small, desperate band of survivors. Me, Ashton, a couple of kids around my age, their faces pale and drawn with fear, and a few older teens, their expressions grim, hardened by something more than just the unfolding apocalypse. One had a bandaged arm, clumsily wrapped, a souvenir from a recent fight in the facility, a reminder of the violence that had always simmered beneath the surface, even before the world went mad. Another kept glancing around, his eyes wide, frightened, darting nervously from shadow to shadow, as if expecting the infected to materialize from thin air. We sat huddled together on the cold floor, the silence in the storeroom oppressive, broken only by the sound of our own breathing, amplified in the enclosed space, feeling loud, intrusive, a dangerous beacon in the oppressive quiet. "Does anyone have a phone?" Ashton whispered, his voice low, strained. A few kids checked pockets, a futile gesture, but none of us had personal devices. Confiscated upon entry to the facility, a lifetime ago, it felt like. The nurse frowned, her face etched with worry. The staff phones were lost in the chaos. My phone was in my... Her voice trailed off, lost in the weight of what was lost, what was gone. "How can we get help?" someone asked, a small voice, barely audible, filled with a desperate, childish hope. She hesitated, her eyes downcast, avoiding our gaze, the weight of responsibility crushing her. "I'm not sure if there's anyone to call," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "The city, I think it's been quarantined. We're on our own." The group fell silent, the weight of her words settling heavily in the air, crushing the last vestiges of hope. I leaned against the cold wall, the chill seeping into my bones, trying to steady my racing thoughts, trying to make sense of the senseless. Images of the facility's corridors, the flickering lights, the vacant stare of the infected, kept flashing behind my eyes, a terrifying loop of horror. But even more than that, more than the immediate terror, I remembered the reason I ended up locked away, the darkness in my own past, the unshakable guilt. What if the world, even this broken, ravaged world, had no place for me now? What if my past, my crime, labeled me forever, even in the face of apocalypse? After a long, suffocating silence, the nurse cleared her throat, a small, decisive sound that broke through the oppressive atmosphere. "We can't stay here long," she said, her voice regaining a semblance of strength, of purpose. "We need supplies. Food, water, maybe a radio. We should find somewhere more secure. Then we can wait until this situation is under control." Wait? For what? For rescue? For order to be restored to a world that seemed irrevocably shattered? Ashton nodded, his face grim, but resolute. "There's probably a grocery store a few blocks south," he said, his voice low, planning, assessing. "It's too dangerous," someone else argued, a voice filled with fear, with the crushing weight of reality. The nurse sighed, a weary, defeated sound. "We don't have a choice," she said, her voice heavy with resignation. "We'll have to move carefully and avoid large groups of those things. If we stick together, we might stand a chance. A chance, a fragile, desperate hope, in a world devoid of guarantees." While we rested in that cramped, airless storeroom, the silence broken only by our ragged breathing, my mind strayed back to the moment that had upended my life, the day everything changed, the day I became a murderer. I had hurt someone, badly. They didn't survive. The details, they weren't necessary, not here, not now. But the memory, the weight of it, haunted me, a constant, gnawing presence. I knew many people, in the old world, in the world that was now gone, believed I deserved whatever fate came to me. Maybe they were right. Trembling against the cold wall of that dark, windowless building, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd be safer if I were alone. Not because I didn't need help, no. I wanted to stay with these people, this small, desperate group, to cling to the fragile hope of community, of shared survival. But maybe they wouldn't want me around if they knew. If they truly knew exactly what I'd done, what darkness lay buried in my past, in the files they kept on me at the facility. Everyone at the facility was labeled, categorized, reduced to their crimes, their mistakes. One kid was rumored to have set fires, consumed by a destructive rage. Another was whispered to be part of a gang, a group that got into serious trouble, their violence escalating, spiraling out of control. We all had our secrets, our shadows, our broken pasts. But mine felt heavier, darker than most. But in this new, broken world, none of that seemed to matter, not to the infected. To them, we were all the same, living, breathing, vulnerable. If they saw you, they came at you, with the same mindless hunger, the same terrifying drive. No questions asked. They didn't know who I was, what I'd done, what darkness I carried within me. I was just another source of sustenance, another target in their endless, horrifying pursuit. The nurse didn't care about my file either. She didn't know my crime, my past darkness. She only saw a kid, scared, lost, in need of help. And I wondered, in the suffocating silence of that storeroom, if maybe the biggest difference between me and those infected creatures shambling through the streets was that I still had a choice to make different decisions, to choose a different path. Now, in this broken, terrifying new world, a chance, maybe, at redemption. After a short, restless rest in the storeroom, the nurse insisted we continue, move on. The building felt too risky, too enclosed, a labyrinth of dark hallways, countless doors, perfect hiding spots for them. She opened the storeroom door a crack, peering cautiously out into the lobby, her eyes darting from shadow to shadow. "All clear," she mouthed, her voice barely a whisper, signaling us to move. We carefully, silently, made our way through the dark halls, stepping around scattered office chairs, abandoned debris, the remnants of a world that had collapsed. We found a side entrance, a narrow doorway that led to an alley outside, a sliver of open space, a path into the unknown. The wind had picked up, swirling through the alley, rustling debris, scattering paper across the grimy ground, carrying with it the chilling moans of the infected, a constant, unsettling soundtrack to our escape. A few blocks down, through the narrow alleyway, we could see the faint glow of a supermarket sign, a beacon of potential supplies, but the rest of the street, swallowed by shadow, was cloaked in darkness, a mystery of unknown terrors. "Let's go," the nurse whispered, her voice strained, urging us forward. We formed a makeshift line, a fragile chain of humanity, hugging the cold brick walls, moving cautiously, silently, every sound amplified in the oppressive quiet, putting us on edge, sending shivers down our spines. A loud crash from somewhere nearby made us freeze, every muscle tensed, hearts pounding, ready to flee. But it turned out to be just a loose metal sign, rattling in the wind, a false alarm, but a stark reminder of the ever-present threat. The tension was unbearable, a suffocating weight pressing down on us, stealing our breath. As we turned the corner onto the main street, I saw movement near a bus stop, a small group, maybe 6, 7, standing motionless in the dim light. Survivors? A desperate flicker of hope. I couldn't tell, not yet, not from this distance. Then they moved, and the unmistakable jerky swaying posture, the unnatural gait, the horrifying truth, revealed itself. More infected. We waited, frozen, hearts hammering against our ribs, until they were far enough away, lumbering down the street, their moans fading into the wind, before tiptoeing along a row of abandoned cars, using them as cover, shadows our only allies. My heart hammered in my chest, a frantic drumbeat, threatening to burst, to betray our fragile silence. The grocery store parking lot was in disarray, a chaotic graveyard of abandoned cars, Smashed windows, broken glass glittering on the asphalt like fallen stars. The main doors, gaping open, an invitation to danger, looked ominously welcoming. One glass panel, shattered into 1,000 shards, lay scattered across the entrance, a testament to the chaos within. We hurried towards the building, driven by desperation, by the gnawing hunger and thirst, seeking refuge, supplies, survival. Inside the grocery store, most of the aisles were dark, swallowed by shadows, the silence oppressive, broken only by our own ragged breathing. Some emergency lighting still flickered, casting a dim, eerie glow, revealing rows upon rows of empty shelves, picked clean, ransacked, a stark testament to the desperation that had preceded us. It seemed like the place had been picked over, stripped bare. There were scattered items on the floor, discarded, unwanted, a few spilled cartons, leaking their contents onto the dusty tiles. Yet, amidst the desolation, we found a small area near the back, a forgotten corner, where canned goods, overlooked in the panic, had been left behind, a small, miraculous cache of sustenance. While the nurse and a couple of the older teens, their faces grim, their movements efficient, went to find a flashlight, navigating the darkness like seasoned scavengers, I stumbled upon a half-opened storage closet, tucked away behind a stack of empty crates. Inside, in the dim light filtering from the aisles, were boxes of bottled water, stacked high, untouched, presumably overlooked in the initial panic, a treasure trove of life. "Ashton," I called out, my voice a hushed shout, barely audible in the vast, silent store. "Water! Over here!" He appeared, emerging from the shadows, his face lighting up with a flicker of hope. Together, we managed to carry several bottles back to the group, our arms aching, our spirits lifting slightly at this small victory. A few other kids, spurred by the discovery, rummaged through the scattered debris, searching for any forgotten snacks that weren't stale, any remnants of food in this desolate landscape. We all congregated in the center of the store, near the produce section, ironically, the only section still somewhat stocked, with bruised, rotting fruits and vegetables, a grim reminder of abundance now turned to decay. The nurse, her face weary but resolute, passed around the water bottles, distributing our meager treasure. Everyone drank greedily, throats raw and sore from nerves, from fear, from lack of water, the liquid offering a small measure of comfort, of temporary relief. Then Ashton, a rare gesture of kindness in this brutal new world, offered me a bag of chips salvaged from some forgotten corner. I realized with a jolt that I was starving, my stomach aching with emptiness. I tore it open, thankful for the bland, processed taste, the comforting crunch, a small, familiar pleasure in the face of overwhelming chaos. It was a quiet moment, a fragile stillness in a storm of chaos, a brief respite from the constant terror. 8 kids, a nurse, gathered in the half-lit remains of a grocery store, sharing meager rations, a temporary haven in a world gone mad. For a split second, in the quiet murmur of voices, in the shared silence, I almost forgot the world outside, the horror that lurked beyond the shattered windows, the infected shambling through the deserted streets. Then, the lights flickered again, a jarring reminder of the fragility of our refuge, and one of the big overhead windows near the entrance rattled violently, a sound that echoed through the store, shattering the fragile illusion of peace. Something was there. A low moan drifted through the broken glass, carried on the wind, a chilling, unmistakable sound. The infected. They had wandered in, drawn by our movement, our noise, the rustling of plastic bags, the faint sounds of life in this desolate place. Silhouettes loomed at the entrance, dark, menacing, grotesque. 1, 2, maybe 5, maybe 6. Hard to tell in the dim light, but enough to send a fresh wave of terror through the group. We collectively tensed, fear gripping us, paralyzing us. The nurse, her face hardening with a grim determination, gestured for us to stay behind her, a silent command, a fragile shield against the encroaching horror. She took a slow, deliberate step toward the aisle, moving cautiously, silently, assessing the threat, trying to buy us time. to find a way out. We tried to stay perfectly still, holding our breath, praying, foolishly, desperately, hoping the infected would stumble by without noticing us, would drift past, unaware of the fragile life huddled in the dim light, clinging to a desperate hope. But then, a younger teen, his nerves frayed, his fear overwhelming, accidentally kicked a fallen can, a discarded tin of beans, lying forgotten on the floor. The metallic clank, sharp, loud, echoing through the vast, silent store, shattered our fragile hope, our desperate illusion of invisibility. Instantly, the silhouettes at the entrance jerked in our direction, their unnatural movements quickening, their moans growing louder, more urgent. Several of them broke into a stiff, unnatural run, their shambling gait accelerating into a terrifying pursuit. "Back!" the nurse whispered, her voice a strained, urgent command, then louder, panic rising in her voice. "Back! Run!" We bolted, fear propelling us, deeper into the store, weaving between aisles of empty shelves, overturned displays, scattered debris, a chaotic, desperate retreat. The infected lurched after us, their limbs swinging strangely, their moans echoing through the store, growing closer, more insistent. We could hear them behind us, crashing through displays, knocking over shelves, scattering debris in their wake, a horrifying pursuit closing in. One older teen tripped over a toppled trash bin, crashing to the floor, a vulnerable target in the path of the onrushing horror. Ashton, without hesitation, risking himself, helped him back to his feet, pulling him up, urging him onward, a moment of selfless courage in the face of overwhelming fear. Meanwhile, the nurse, her face pale but resolute, tried to lead us towards an exit sign, illuminated in a flickering red glow, pointing towards the rear of the store, a desperate escape route. My stomach clenched, fear a cold knot in my gut, as the footsteps and moans grew closer, louder, more menacing. We dashed through a stockroom door, a narrow doorway offering a fragile barrier, pushing it shut behind us, slamming it closed against the encroaching horror. There was no lock, just a broken latch, a flimsy defense against the relentless onslaught. Ashton and I, fueled by adrenaline and desperation, pressed our bodies against it, straining, muscles burning, trying to hold it closed as the infected pounded from the other side, their fists, their bodies, slamming against the thin wooden door, threatening to break through, to overwhelm us. "Move!" the nurse gasped, her voice strained, barely audible above the pounding, the moans, the frantic rhythm of our own hearts. "We need another way out." A narrow hallway stretched ahead, dimly lit, leading deeper into the unknown. Another sign, illuminated in faint emergency light, indicated a service elevator, a potential trap, a possible escape. Another sign, more promising, pointed to a set of stairs. "This way," I shouted, my voice hoarse, desperate, pointing to the stairs, a downward path, a route away from the immediate threat. The group rushed down, a chaotic scramble, a flight of stairs leading to a loading dock, a desperate gamble, a hope for freedom. The door to the loading dock, heavy, steel, bolted shut, was locked with a thick, heavy chain, secured with a padlock. One of the older kids, resourceful in the face of desperation, grabbed a broken piece of metal, jagged, sharp, from the scattered debris, and used it as a makeshift tool, a desperate pry bar, to attack the chain, to force it open. While we waited, hearts pounding, breaths held, time stretching into an eternity, we could hear them. Behind us, from upstairs, the stockroom door burst open, splintering wood, shattering the fragile barrier. We heard scraping footsteps, shuffling gait, the horrifying sounds of the infected pouring into the stockroom, closing in, their moans growing louder, more insistent, a terrifying promise of what was to come. "Hurry!" the nurse screamed, her voice cracking with fear, with desperation. The chain snapped, finally giving way, the padlock falling to the concrete floor with a metallic clang, echoing in the oppressive silence. The door to the load dock swung outward, a gateway to the night, to the unknown. We rushed through, a desperate scramble, stumbling onto a concrete ramp, sloping downwards, leading to the outside alley, to the fragile hope of escape. We stumbled into the night, breath ragged, lungs burning, hearts racing, adrenaline coursing through our veins, a chaotic, desperate exodus. A few infected, drawn by the noise, milled around the far end of the alley, grotesque silhouettes in the dim light. But they hadn't spotted us yet, hadn't registered our presence. We took a chance, a desperate gamble, and sprinted in the opposite direction, away from the alley's mouth, ducking behind dumpsters, weaving through the narrow path, a frantic, silent escape. Finally, miraculously, we emerged onto another street, another stretch of deserted asphalt, lit by sporadic, unreliable street lamps, casting long, distorted shadows, painting the world in shades of gray and fear. Everyone looked exhausted, drained, on the verge of collapse. The nurse, her face pale, her breath ragged, nearly crumpled to the ground, her strength finally failing. We helped her to a nearby bench, a small, fleeting respite in our desperate flight, a moment to catch our breath, to regroup, to assess the damage. In that moment, feeling my chest burn from the desperate run, my lungs aching for air, I understood, with a chilling clarity, that every living human, in this ravaged world, was fighting the same battle now. Regardless of their past, their crimes, their darkness, we were all just trying to survive, clinging to life in the face of overwhelming death. But I couldn't ignore the truth. My truth. I was a murderer. I'd taken a life, and no outbreak, no apocalypse, could erase that. In the old world, that meant I was locked up, caged, separated from society. In this new world, it seemed, nobody cared anymore. Society had crumbled, rules had shattered, order had dissolved into chaos. My crime, my punishment, suddenly seemed insignificant, irrelevant in the face of global annihilation. I caught Ashton glancing at me, his eyes filled with a weariness that mirrored my own. "You okay?" he asked quietly, his voice low, barely audible above the wind. I nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement. "Yeah." "You're not," he said, his gaze steady, unflinching. "None of us are." I shook my head, a slow, despairing movement. I guess I'm not used to all this." He laughed, a short, hollow sound, devoid of humor, filled only with exhaustion and despair. "Who is?" We both stared down the dark street, a bleak, desolate vista, broken glass glimmering under the weak light of a distant street lamp, casting eerie reflections, shapes wandering aimlessly in the shadows, grotesque silhouettes against the dying light. Once she caught her breath, the nurse stood, her posture regaining a semblance of resolve, her face pale but determined. "We need to find somewhere to stay for the night," she said, her voice firm, practical, focusing on immediate survival. "A building with only one or two entrances, somewhere we can block them off." She was right. Shelter, security, survival, the only things that mattered now. We pressed forward, a small, desperate group, searching the darkened city blocks, our eyes scanning the deserted buildings, seeking refuge in the urban wasteland. Eventually, through the gloom and shadows, we spotted a large church, looming against the night sky, its silhouette stark and imposing. Thick wooden doors, heavy, solid, promised security. The windows, high, stained glass, mostly intact, offered a fragile barrier. It seemed safer, more defensible, than the other options we'd passed, the shattered storefronts, the empty office buildings, the gaping doorways to unknown terrors. We approached the churchyard, hesitantly, cautiously, a fragile hope flickering in the darkness. The fence, wrought iron, imposing, was locked, barring our way. But Ashton, agile, desperate, scaled it, his movements quick, practiced, dropping down silently on the other side, a shadow in the night. He pushed from within, straining against the rusted metal, and managed to unhook a rusted latch, the gate groaning open with a loud creak, a sound that seemed deafening in the oppressive silence. We hurried toward the church door, our footsteps echoing in the deserted courtyard, a sanctuary, a potential haven. It was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness beckoning us in, as if someone had forced it open, a silent invitation or a terrifying warning. Inside, the main hall was deserted, silent, swallowed by shadow. A few broken pews lay scattered across the floor, overturned relics of a forgotten faith, but the sturdy doors, the thick walls, offered a sense of security, of refuge. They could be barricaded. The nurse and a couple of the older teens, their faces grim, their movements efficient, moved around the church, checking doors, securing entrances, searching for any hidden infected, any lurking danger within the sanctuary. They returned, after what felt like an eternity, their faces etched with relief, a fragile respite from the constant terror. "Seems clear," the nurse said, her voice low, weary, but firm. "Let's settle here for a while. We can rest and figure out our next move in the morning." And so we did. We used chairs, heavy pews, any objects we could find, to block the doors, creating a makeshift barricade, a fragile barrier against the horrors of the outside world. We found a couple of candles near the altar, flickering flames casting dancing shadows on the stained glass windows, giving us a little light, a small measure of comfort in the overwhelming darkness. Everyone huddled together, seeking warmth, seeking solace in shared humanity, a fragile island of life in a sea of death. But a few hours later, in the deepest part of the night, I woke, disoriented, the silence broken only by the soft sigh of the wind. The church was darker now, the candle flames guttering low, and I saw the nurse was gone. So were two others, the older teens who had helped secure the doors, vanished without a trace. A soft breeze drifted in through the side door, unnoticed in the darkness, which was left slightly open, a gaping wound in our fragile sanctuary. I had no idea where they went, why they left. For a moment, a desperate flicker of hope. Maybe she was trying to find help, to radio for rescue, to find some vestige of the old world. But a darker fear, a chilling premonition, whispered in my mind. Lost hope? Or something? Something lured them outside. Something terrifying. Something irresistible. None of us knew. We waited, huddled together in the darkness, fear gnawing at us. But she never came back. We searched the surrounding hallways in the church, our whispers echoing in the vast, empty space, calling her name in hushed tones, our voices swallowed by the silence. We found no trace of her, no sign of the others, only that open door at the side, leading into the dim city, a doorway to the unknown, a gaping maw promising only danger. Some of the kids, their voices trembling, their eyes wide with fear, suggested we wait until dawn, clinging to the fragile hope of rescue, of return. Others, more pragmatic, more desperate, said we should move on, leave the fragile sanctuary, because we didn't have enough food, enough water, to stay for long, to wait for a help that might never come. We voted, a small, desperate democracy in the face of apocalypse, and decided to stay until sunrise, a compromise born of fear and dwindling hope. Traveling in darkness, into the unknown terrors of the city night, felt too risky, too suicidal. We took turns keeping watch at the windows, peering out into the pre-dawn gloom, our eyes straining for any movement, any sign of danger. But exhaustion weighed on us, heavy, suffocating, stealing our strength, our resolve. I wasn't sure if I was more afraid of the infected lurking outside the church walls, or the guilt that followed me everywhere, a constant, inescapable shadow, a reminder of my broken past, my irreparable crime. Morning light, pale, gray, crept through the high windows, filtering through the stained glass, casting long, distorted shadows across the deserted church hall, illuminating dust motes floating in the air, dancing in the weak sunlight. We noticed faint shapes moving outside the church fence, grotesque silhouettes against the pale dawn, possibly more infected, drawn by our presence, by the lingering scent of life. They seemed unaware of us, thankfully, drifting aimlessly, shambling, moaning, oblivious to the fragile lives huddled within the sanctuary. We gathered what little supplies we had left, the dwindling water bottles, the scraps of food, preparing to leave the church, to face the uncertain terrors of the day. Nobody said it, but we all felt an invisible weight now, a shift in the fragile dynamic of our group. Our nurse was gone. She was our link to the old world, to the rules and structure we'd once known. However flawed, however confining, she was gone, and with her, a piece of our fragile hope, our illusion of order, had vanished into the darkness. We exited through the front door, pushing aside our makeshift barricade, a flimsy barrier of chairs and pews, stepping back into the world of the infected, the world of chaos. The day was gray, silent, the city's rooftops bathed in a dull, lifeless glow, the air heavy with unspoken dread. We moved carefully through the courtyard, scanning for threats, our senses heightened, our nerves raw, every shadow a potential danger, every sound a possible harbinger of death. As we made our way down the street, deserted, desolate, we passed cars that had been left abandoned in the middle of the road, doors gaping open, silent witnesses to sudden panic, to desperate flight. A few had opened doors, empty, driverless, but no sign of their owners, vanished, swallowed by the chaos. Papers fluttered across the cracked asphalt, carried by the chilling wind, remnants of a world that had ceased to exist. Occasionally, in the distance, we spotted one or two zombies, shambling figures against the gray landscape, stumbling, turning in slow circles, aimlessly wandering, lost in their endless hunger. We tried to keep our footsteps quiet, our movements silent, our presence unnoticed, but the tension was suffocating, a palpable weight pressing down on us, stealing our breath, our hope. And I couldn't stop my mind from wandering back to the reason I was locked up in the first place, the darkness of my past, the unshakable guilt. In the span of a few days, a blink of an eye in the grand scheme of things, the entire system that caged me, that defined me, had collapsed, dissolved into nothingness. I was free now, but did I deserve it? Did freedom even have meaning in a world like this? Or was it just another form of terrifying isolation? As we moved past a small park, overgrown, neglected, a girl about my age, Sky, her name was, fell into step beside me, her face pale, her eyes ringed with exhaustion. She looked up at me, her gaze steady, surprisingly direct. "I've heard rumors about you," she whispered, her voice low, barely audible, a hesitant confession. I stiffened, my muscles tensing, my breath catching in my throat. "They say you ended someone's life." The accusation hung in the air, heavy, accusatory, echoing the labels, the judgments that had haunted me for so long. I didn't reply, couldn't deny it, didn't lie either. We kept walking, the silence stretching between us, filled with unspoken judgments, unspoken fears. After a long moment, she spoke again, her voice softer this time, less accusatory, almost understanding. "You did something wrong," she said, her gaze fixed on the cracked pavement ahead. "So did I. So did Ashton. So did everyone in that building. Doesn't mean we can't try to do better." A fragile olive branch extended in the wasteland of our broken world. I took a shaky breath, the air catching in my lungs. "I don't know if I can," I admitted, my voice barely a whisper, raw with self-doubt, with the unshakable weight of guilt. "That kind of thing doesn't go away." She nodded, her eyes acknowledging the darkness, the weight of the past. "But maybe now," she said, her voice filled with a fragile hope. "In this new world, we can try to help each other." The words sank in, slow, hesitant, like seeds falling on barren ground. Help each other? Redemption? Was that even possible for someone like me? I had no idea what my future held, or if I would even make it through the next day, the next hour. But it was the first time, in a long, dark year, that someone had suggested I might still have a chance at redemption, some chance to make a different choice than the one I made before, to walk a different path, even in this broken, terrifying world. Eventually, our small group reached a crossroads, a literal junction of fate. To one side, a stretch of highway, a ribbon of asphalt, led out of the city towards the unknown vastness of the countryside. To the other, the heart of downtown loomed, a concrete jungle of tall buildings, skyscrapers like silent guardians, monuments to a vanished civilization. We had no idea what lay beyond the city limits, what terrors or hopes awaited us in the rural landscape. But there was a chance, a desperate gamble, that it was less populated, less overrun with the infected. Yet downtown, the heart of the city, might hold rescue centers, emergency aid, remnants of organized resistance, a desperate hope for salvation. Ashton and a few others, their faces set with grim determination, wanted to head for the highway, the open road, believing we'd find fewer infected out there. A better chance of survival in the desolate countryside. Sky and a couple more, clinging to a fragile hope of rescue, thought heading into the city center, towards the looming skyscrapers, might lead to organized help, military presence, relief convoys, a desperate gamble for salvation. That left me torn, conflicted, uncertain, as the deciding vote, the one who would determine our path, our fate. Half the group, their faces worn and worried, waited for my answer, their eyes fixed on me, placing the weight of their survival, their hopes, their fears, in my hands. I looked at both paths, stretching out before me, each one uncertain, each one fraught with unknown dangers, unknown possibilities. Highway or downtown, escape or rescue, despair or hope. I opened my mouth to speak, to make a choice, to decide our fate. But no words came out, my throat tight with indecision, with fear, with the crushing weight of responsibility. At first, silence, heavy, oppressive, broken only by the sigh of the wind, sweeping dust across the cracked pavement, a ghostly whisper in the deserted cityscape. In the distance, a solitary infected figure shuffled aimlessly by a burnt-out car, a grotesque silhouette against the gray horizon, a stark reminder of the ever-present danger. For a moment, time seemed to stand still, the world holding its breath, waiting for my decision. And in that moment, an image flashed through my mind, unbidden, unwanted, the expression on my victim's face, all those months ago, back when everything was normal, back when life still held meaning, back when my choices still had consequences in a world that made sense. The memory stung, sharp, agonizing, and I almost felt unworthy. Unworthy to make such a decision, unworthy to choose for these people, unworthy of even being alive in this broken world. Then, another thought, a stark, chilling realization, broke through the fog of guilt and despair. The zombie outbreak had leveled all the rules, shattered all the structures of the old world. I was no longer an inmate, no longer bound by society's walls, no longer defined by my crime. Did that mean I was free? Or just lost? Adrift in a sea of chaos, without anchor, without direction, without hope? I glanced at the worn, worried faces around me. These kids, these teens, my companions in this desperate flight, their fates intertwined with mine. We were just kids, well, teens, barely on the cusp of adulthood, thrust into a world of unimaginable horror, forced to make impossible choices, to decide our own fate, in a world that offered no guarantees, no promises, only endless terror. My throat felt tight, constricted with fear, with indecision, with the crushing weight of responsibility. I tried to speak again, to break the suffocating silence. I began, my voice a hoarse whisper, then trailed off, the words failing me. The choice too heavy, too uncertain. No matter which path I chose, highway or downtown, it wouldn't guarantee safety, wouldn't promise survival. But we couldn't keep standing there, frozen by fear, paralyzed by indecision. We had to move. We had to choose. We had to face whatever lay ahead. I turned to them, to Ashton, to Sky, to the others, their faces etched with fear, with hope, with desperation, exhaling slowly, trying to steady my voice, to project some semblance of resolve, some flicker of leadership in the overwhelming darkness. I think we should, but before I could finish the sentence, before I could utter the word that would decide our path, a low, guttural moan rumbled from somewhere behind us, a chilling, unmistakable sound that cut through the silence, shattering the fragile stillness. Instinctively, we all turned, our hearts leaping into our throats, fear spiking, adrenaline surging. Several infected had emerged from a side street, drawn by the sight of us, their shuffling forms materializing from the shadows, their moans echoing through the deserted streets. a terrifying threat closing in. "Go!" Ashton hissed, his voice urgent, desperate, pushing past fear, driven by pure instinct. We broke into a run, a chaotic, desperate scramble, hearts pounding, scattering in the direction each of us had last decided, driven by a primal urge to survive, to escape the immediate danger. Some sprinted toward the highway, a desperate flight to the open road, a gamble for survival in the vast unknown. Others, clinging to a fragile hope of rescue, dashed toward downtown, into the heart of the city, towards the looming skyscrapers, a desperate gamble for salvation. In the panic, the chaos, I saw shapes passing me in both directions, a fleeting glimpse of Ashton, waving at me to follow him towards the highway, a desperate invitation, a silent promise. Sky ran the other way, her figure disappearing into the shadows, towards the city's heart, a lone silhouette against the dying light. For a moment, I froze, paralyzed by indecision, caught between two paths, two destinies, fear gripping me, immobilizing me. Figures stumbled after us, arms outstretched, reaching blindly, their moans echoing in the empty streets, a horrifying chorus of death. I was a murderer, the old world told me, the labels, the judgments, echoing in my mind. That meant I'd lost my right to live freely among everyone else. But now, in this new reality, everything was inverted, twisted, grotesque. There were no more guards, no more fences, no more rules, no more judgments. There was just survival. I looked one last time at Ashton, his figure receding into the distance, waving at me, urging me onward, towards the highway, towards escape. Sky ran the other way, a lone figure disappearing into the city's heart, towards an uncertain hope. My legs began to move, almost on their own, driven by instinct, by adrenaline, by the primal urge to survive. I sprinted, weaving through abandoned cars, dodging debris, ignoring the shouts around me, the desperate cries of the others, focused only on escape, on survival. I vaulted over a low barricade, a sudden surge of adrenaline. The infected were close behind, their moans growing louder, more insistent, but I couldn't spare a glance, couldn't afford to look back. The road stretched out ahead, a strip of asphalt leading into the unknown, a path to freedom or to death. Buildings loomed in the other direction, skyscrapers like silent guardians, just as dark, just as uncertain, a different path, a different fate. Behind me, a few zombie figures snatched at the air, their grotesque movements slow, clumsy, pathetic. But they were too slow. My feet pounded the pavement, the rhythm of my escape, and the adrenaline coursing through my veins gave me speed, gave me strength, gave me a desperate, exhilarating sense of freedom. In that moment, running for my life, fleeing from death, I realized, with a chilling clarity, that the outbreak, this terrible, horrifying apocalypse, had, in a twisted, perverse way, given me something I never would have had before. A chance to run free. No more steel bars, no more watchful guards, no more labels, no more judgments. Just open road and the terrifying freedom of the unknown. But I also felt the weight of responsibility, the burden of choice. The question throbbed in my mind, a constant, insistent pulse, a reminder of my past, my future, my very being. What would I do with this freedom? Would I be no better than before, driven by rage, by darkness, hurting others for my own survival, consumed by my own selfish needs? Or could I redeem myself, find some measure of atonement by protecting those around me, by doing whatever I could to help, to heal, to build something new in the ruins of the old world? I glanced over my shoulder, a fleeting, dangerous movement, but the small group of infected was falling behind, their shambling gait no match for my desperate flight, my desperate will to survive. Ahead, an empty road called me forward, beckoned me into the unknown, a ribbon of asphalt stretching towards the horizon, towards an uncertain future. The pounding in my chest reminded me I was still alive, still human, fragile, flawed, burdened by my past, but still alive. I pushed forward, driven by a desperate hope, by a terrifying freedom, wind whipping through my hair. A swirl of dust kicked up around me, a solitary figure against a desolate landscape. My mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, a torrent of questions, uncertainties, fears, hopes, dreams, but I wasn't sure what came next, where this lonely road would lead. Would I find a new life on the highway, away from the city, away from the ghosts of my past? Would I cross paths with Ashton or Sky again? Or anyone else who once shared that facility with me, that prison of gray walls and echoing silence? Would I ever see another friendly face, another sign of humanity in this ravaged world? I didn't know. What I did know, with a chilling certainty, was this: I was a murderer. Yet, in a twisted turn of fate, the undead, the monsters, had broken the walls around me, shattered my cage, and set me free. Now, I was out in a world where the rules were shattered, where society had dissolved and only survival mattered, only the brutal, primal struggle for life against death. Maybe I could start over. Maybe I could find a better path, forge a new identity in the ruins of the old world, a path towards redemption, towards atonement. Or maybe I would become a monster, worse than any infected creature shambling through the streets, consumed by darkness, driven by my own selfish needs, my own broken past. With each step I took down that lonely stretch of asphalt, further and further away from the city, further and further into the unknown, I felt the burning question growing within me, consuming me, defining me. Who am I now? In this new world? Am I still a murderer? Or can I be something more? Something better? I may never know how this story ends, may never find the answers I desperately seek. But for the first time in my life, truly, terrifyingly, I was free to find out. Thank you for listening. If this story sent shivers down your spine, don't forget to like and subscribe for more unsettling creepypastas. Your support keeps this channel alive. Until next time, stay vigilant and remember, curiosity can be quite the companion and sometimes a curse. This story, while rooted in horror, explores deeper themes of guilt, freedom, and redemption. The zombie outbreak serves as a catalyst, stripping away societal structures and forcing the protagonist to confront his past and his potential future in a world without rules. It leaves us pondering: can true freedom be found in chaos? Can redemption be earned even after committing terrible acts? And what defines us when everything we once knew is gone? The open ending emphasizes the uncertainty and the ongoing internal battle of the protagonist, leaving the audience to wonder about his ultimate fate. Did this journey into the apocalypse leave you breathless? Want to know what happens next on the highway as our protagonist faces an uncertain future? Let me know in the comments if you want a part 2. Don't forget to smash that like button if you enjoyed this story, and subscribe for more chilling tales of horror and suspense. Your support means everything and helps keep these stories coming. Let's delve deeper into this broken world together. Comment below with your thoughts and theories. Highway or downtown? What path should he choose? And until next time, stay vigilant and don't let curiosity lead you down a dark path you can't return from.